Okay, hello everybody. Thanks for spending a little time with me today, whatever time of day it is for you. I'm here to talk about what I think is one of the most fascinating phenomena in Christianity, in religion, and that is monasticism. Now, monasticism is something that many of us, I think, are only kind of dimly aware of. Now, of course, I'm going to be focusing in this lecture on early forms of monasticism in the ancient world, but it is worth pointing out that monasticism is very much a living phenomenon in the Christian world today. So, for instance, in the Roman Catholic tradition, there are a number of monastic orders. Here's a Benedictine nun, you can see there. But in other forms of Christianity, in Eastern Orthodoxy, there is a vibrant monastic wing of the church. In the Egyptian church, the Coptic church, there is a very deep tradition of monasticism, as we will see momentarily. In the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, you may not even have ever heard of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, but it exists and it's very ancient, and it too continues to foster traditions of monasticism. Now, this is not even to mention other religions, which we won't be talking about today, that also boast monastic traditions. Of Buddhism, I think most famously, most people know the Dalai Lama, Hinduism as well. So monasticism is something that is perhaps not quite as popular as it used to be, but is still very much with us, both outside of Christianity and within us. So what is it? I mean, I think before going any further, we need to try to nail down what monasticism actually is. And that is a more difficult task than one might think, because the more you study Christian monasticism, the more you realize that it can take on an almost infinite variety of forms. So it's difficult to try to boil it down to common denominators, but that's precisely what I'm going to do for you today. So 3 common denominators of early Christian monasticism. The first is built in to the word monastic itself. It comes from a Greek word which means one who is alone. A monachos is one who is alone. So monasticism requires some degree of separation from society. It need not entail utter isolation. You don't necessarily have to go hundreds of miles into the desert and live all by your lonesome to be a monk. But you can't really be a monk and work on Wall Street, okay? So there has to be some kind of separation. The second point is asceticism. This is possibly a new word for some of you. It actually has nothing to do with the Greek word aesthetic. It's a completely different thing. Asceticism comes from a Greek word. It comes from the word askesis, which means something like training or discipline. So something that athletes or soldiers would undergo. And in terms of early Christianity, asceticism refers specifically to the voluntary renunciation of bodily pleasures that are not sinful in and of themselves, but that might in some way hinder one's spiritual growth. And there's lots of different early monastic practices that could be described as ascetic. Monks were quite famous for fasting for long periods of time. Monks often performed vigils, that is, they stayed up most of the night and deprived themselves of sleep. But above all, monasticism, no matter what form it took, no matter where you were in the Christian world, asceticism, monastic asceticism required voluntary, lifelong celibacy. Okay? So a commitment to abstain from any and all forms of sexual behavior. Thoughts too, but certainly behavior. Now, what is this asceticism for? Is it just punishing yourself? Did the early monks practice asceticism because they thought the body was evil or something like that? No, not necessarily. The third common denominator is the goal of Christian monasticism, which is spiritual and moral growth. And we might want to put it even more strongly and say that communion or even union with God was the ultimate goal. That is why you separate yourself from society. That is why you perform these feats of asceticism, precisely so that you might be transformed into deeper communion with God. So that's what monasticism is in a nutshell. Now I want to talk about when and where we first see stirrings of Christian monasticism. Now, we know he's not the first Christian monk because we know that he sort of apprenticed himself to other monk-like figures. But the earliest Christian monk that we can identify and name is Saint Anthony, sometimes known as Anthony the Great. Before talking about him specifically, well, I will say this about Anthony. We think he headed out into the desert and really embraced the monastic life around 270 or so. So this is important because it means that whatever we want to say about early Christian monasticism, it cannot be simply a reaction to Constantine and Constantine's legalization of Christianity, which happens in 313, and Constantine's subsequent favoring of Christianity. So it can't just be a negative reaction to that because it began several decades before that. But it is certainly the case that the Constantinian revolution, the legalization of Christianity, the increasing dominance of Christianity in politics and in society is going to change the church. And in some obvious ways, it's going to change the church for the better. Christians are no longer being martyred for their faith. But some might say that the Constantinian revolution had some rather negative effects on the moral and spiritual fiber of the church. Because for the first 300 years of Christianity, if you became a Christian, you were incurring a real risk. Now, odds were in your favor that you would not have to die as a martyr, but that possibility was there. And of course, that is going to sort of winnow the kinds of people who actually join the church. Well, after 313, after the Edict of Milan, there's really no risk in becoming a Christian. And in fact, as time goes on, and as more and more emperors embraced Christianity, if anything, there were social and political benefits to being a Christian. And if you were a serious Christian, the kind of person who was willing to be a martyr, you might be a bit dismayed by some of these developments. You might be a bit dismayed as you looked around in church on Sunday morning and saw an awful lot of people who didn't seem terribly interested in following those hard sayings of Jesus, to take up one's cross and follow him, to love him more than father or mother, to sell everything, give to the poor, and follow Jesus. So what if you want to live that way? What if you want to obey the command of Jesus, but the people around you, the so-called Christians around you, don't seem terribly interested in that? Well, one possibility is to head to the desert, and that is precisely what Anthony does. Now, this brings us to the where of early Christian monasticism. Saint Anthony was a native Egyptian, and indeed, Egypt is the matrix, the birthplace of Christian monasticism. Now, we know that very soon after the time of Anthony. There were monastic movements afoot in other places like Asia Minor and Syria, but Egypt is really ground zero for early Christian monasticism. Syria, too, I should definitely mention Syria. Now, almost from the beginning, even in Egypt, we see two fundamental forms of early Christian monasticism. The first is sort of exemplified by Anthony here, and that is, as you can see on the screen, eremitic monasticism. That word eremitic is related to our English word hermit. So this is a kind of extreme form of monasticism where the person goes out either completely on their own or with maybe just a couple of comrades. And you really do try to live the monastic life in utter separation from society. Anthony's story, Anthony is sort of arguably the first true eremitic monk. His story sort of illustrates the dynamic that I was talking about a moment ago. He was from a fairly wealthy Egyptian family. His parents had died and left him with quite a lot. And one day he goes into church and he hears the reading from Matthew 19, which is Jesus is saying to the rich young ruler who wants to be perfect. And Jesus says, "Go sell your possessions, give to the poor, come and follow me." And Anthony hears that. And Anthony has the audacity, the temerity, the chutzpah to actually do what Jesus said. I mean, can you imagine the nerve of this guy? He does it. He gets rid of all his worldly goods. He has a sister. He puts her into a kind of what we would call today a convent. And he heads off to the desert all by himself. One point, he lives for 20 years in an abandoned fort with virtually no human contact at all. So that's eremitic monasticism. But right around the same time, there's another form of monasticism, and it's this form of monasticism, also in Egypt, that is going to be the kind of monasticism that will really flourish, that will really explode in popularity as we move out of late antiquity into the Middle Ages. And again, we're not sure that he is the first person to actually organize communal monasticism, but the first person we know of who does this is Saint Pachomius. You can see that he is a contemporary of Anthony, but a younger contemporary. So he's the one to know. Around 320 or so, he organizes a kind of monastic compound, one of the world's first Christian monasteries on the banks of the Upper Nile. All the people who wanted to join his community had to make certain pledges. They had to give up all of their personal possessions. So they had to sort of take a vow of poverty. They had to make a promise to obey their superior, in this case, Pachomius. So a vow of obedience. And of course, as I said a moment ago, it was a sort of baseline expectation of early Christian monasticism that celibacy is something that the monk would practice. So here we have already in the earliest stages of Christian monasticism, we have the three traditional monastic vows. The vow of poverty, which does not mean that you have to live in, without food or without shelter. It just means you don't have any private property. Any goods that you enjoy are goods that are ultimately owned by the community. A vow of celibacy, a promise of lifelong sexual abstinence, and obedience to one's abbot. An abbot is the head, the CEO of a monastery. Now, I do want to pause here and make an important note, which is that even though I've only been talking about men so far, again, from the earliest decades of Christian monasticism, women participated in this movement. And there was a general acknowledgement among Christians that this was a good thing and that women could practice the rigors of the monastic life just as well as men could. Speaking of Pachomius, Pachomius's sister Mary was a kind of abbess of a monastery for women nearby Pachomius's own monastery. And I want to show you an image of one of the most famous, maybe the most famous early Christian female monastic, Saint Mary of Egypt. This is not Pachomius' sister, this is someone different. She was actually a prostitute and had a religious experience and embraced the monastic life and became a renowned saint. All right. Well, if you think about the places I've mentioned so far, places like Egypt, places like Asia Minor, Syria, we could add Palestine to the list. All of these places are in the Greek East of the Roman Empire, the eastern half of the Roman Empire. So we need to acknowledge that really for about the first 100 years or so of its existence, monasticism was primarily, if not exclusively, an Eastern Christian phenomenon. However, in time, it is going to spread to the western half of the Roman Empire, the Latin West, where it is going to become wildly popular. So by the end of the 4th century, we start to see pretty evident popularity of monasticism in the Latin West. So now I want to turn to the most significant figure in the entire history of Western Christian monasticism, and that is Saint Benedict of Nursia. And if you look at his dates for a moment, born in 480, died in 547, he is a real hinge figure. In my classes, I always sort of date the beginning of the Middle Ages around the year 500, partly because that's just very easy to remember. But if you take that definition of the Middle Ages as beginning around the year 500, you see that Saint Benedict belongs to both late antiquity and also the early monastic period. We know very little about the man Benedict. He did found a monastery in southern Italy known as Monte Cassino, and there it is today. It was destroyed during World War II, but then rebuilt, and what you see there is the rebuilt monastery. But the reason for Benedict's influence was not so much his work at this monastery, but the rule, the monastic rule that he wrote for that community. It was a rule that he did write, for his community at Monte Cassino, but he clearly hoped that other monastic communities would adopt his rule. And I think even though it took a couple hundred years for that to happen, his expectations were wildly surpassed. Benedict really believed that the future of Christian monasticism lay in communal monasticism. But communal monasticism is very difficult to pull off successfully because communal monasticism requires people to live in close quarters with other people who are not their family members. And this is a problem because other people are annoying, as some of you are finding out this semester. So he wants to come up with a rule that is going to address some of the potential problems that come with life in community. So let me talk a little bit about this rule and some of its characteristics. If you were to read this rule, you would probably find it rather strict, but probably not harsh. That's not a word that one would associate with Benedict's rule. It did require, from our perspective, a rather ascetic life, but in the context of early Christian monasticism, its level of asceticism was rather moderate. The monks were given 2 meals a day, each with 2 cooked dishes and with fresh fruits and vegetables, if those were available. Some monks out in the desert were subsisting on bread and water. So this is not a shabby arrangement. Each monk got wine every day, about a pint of wine every day. Each monk has his own bed. No sleeping on the ground. You had a bed with a cover and a pillow. Um, and in terms of discipline, it was a very forgiving rule. It is almost impossible to be permanently expelled from a Benedictine monastery because there were so many second and third and fourth and fifth chances offered to the monks. Now, what was an ordinary day like in a Benedictine monastery? I want to give you some sense of the rhythm of life here. Above all, it was a life of prayer. Now, that includes some private prayer, but when I say prayer in a monastic context, I'm talking mainly about communal prayer at set times in the monastic chapel. And by and large, people are not praying extemporaneously. In other words, they're not sort of making up their prayers as they go along. They're praying through the Psalms. Okay? And they get together 8 times in every 24-hour period to do this. 7 times during the day and 1 time at night. So here's the monastic schedule, if you will, which is known as the divine office. And you don't need to worry about memorizing any of these. I just wanted to give you a sense of what their day looked like. So these were the times where they gathered for communal prayer. At least one of these should look somewhat familiar to you. You'll see that Vespers was the early evening hour of prayer. So praying the divine office, getting together these 8 times, that in itself took about 4 hours of each day. Another 4 hours were taken up with sort of individual quiet time, meditation, scripture reading, private prayer, reading, things like that. That left about 6 hours for manual labor, because that was usually expected of monks, that they were engaged in some kind of manual labor. And then that leaves 10 hours for eating and sleeping. Now, I don't know about you, but 10 hours every day for eating and sleeping sounds downright luxurious. So this is in some ways a strict lifestyle, but in other ways, a feasible one, one that is not going to break most monks. Now, as I said, Benedict stands at the threshold of the Middle Ages. And in many ways, the medieval period, which we're just starting to study in this course, is the golden age of Christian monasticism. The Benedictine monasticism is going to remain a major force all throughout the Middle Ages. And in fact, there will even be Benedictine renewal movements. And I want to mention one of those here. The Cistercian movement. The Cistercians are named after this abbey church that you see here in Citeaux, in France. Cistercium was the Latin name for it. It was founded in 1098, so in the period of time that we would call the High Middle Ages, 500 years after the time of Benedict. And the Cistercians thought of themselves as hyper-Benedictines. They thought that there were way too many monasteries that alleged to follow the rule of St. Benedict, but they actually cut a lot of corners and they didn't really follow the rule of Benedict in its strictness. And so they wanted to create a network of monasteries that did just that. And they really believed that the rule of St. Benedict was the best possible template for anyone really determined to live a life of imitation of Christ. Now, one of the most famous early Cistercians is also one of the most famous figures of the entire Middle Ages, Bernard of Clairvaux. And you can see in this icon here that he's holding the rule of Saint Benedict. I should mention that there are still Cistercians today, and one of the most famous Christian authors of the 20th century was a Cistercian, Thomas Merton, who actually lived just to the north of us at a monastery in Kentucky. All right. Finally, I want to talk about another monastic movement of the Middle Ages, but one that was really innovative and in many ways took monasticism in a very different direction than that of the Benedictines or the Cistercians. Starting in the 13th century, we see a new kind of Christian monastic, the friar, as in Friar. And friars are not really monks. It's kind of inaccurate to call them monks. For one thing, they were not bound to their monasteries. So, most monks were expected to stay on the grounds of the abbey unless they had a compelling reason to leave. But the friars were very deliberately sort of out and about in the town, in the street, in ordinary churches, and that sort of thing. So that's pretty different than the monasticism. Secondly, friars saw their mission as service. And solitude is something that doesn't really permit the kind of service that the friars wanted to be engaged in. So if they're not really monks, why am I even talking about the friars in a lecture on monasticism? Well, it's because it is also accurate to say that the friars are products of the monastic tradition. So if you understand the monastic tradition in a very broad sense, you need to include the friars. Why would I say that? Again, two reasons. Number one, friars, like monks, lived according to a rule. They were not just sort of making up their religious life as they went along. And they continued to make those traditional monastic vows of poverty, celibacy, and obedience. Now, there are many different groups of Christian friars starting in the Middle Ages, but the two most important, I think without question, are the Dominicans and the Franciscans, both of which are named after their founder. So Dominic is the founder of the Dominicans, Francis of the Franciscans. And I want to say something about Francis here. You'll be reading excerpts from his biography in a couple of weeks, so you're going to be learning more about him. He started a new religious order in the year 1209 that became fabulously popular. By the end of the century, there were about 28,000 Franciscan friars in Europe. And I mention this partly because, to the extent that many of us have a picture of medieval Christianity, it is a very grim picture. It is a picture of a corrupt and decadent church. And there is some truth to that picture, but there is another side to the story of the medieval church. Because in the Middle Ages, there are tens of thousands of Christians who were willing to make some pretty radical sacrifices in order to live a life of obedience to the crucified Christ. And of course, it's possible to think that these monks and friars may have been misguided in many ways, but I think it's awfully hard, for Christians at least, to criticize their intentions. All right, thanks for spending some time with me.